I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez.
And I'm Jeremy Carl.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. And you can subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to kick off today with Ben going over the Hunter Biden verdict on federal gun charges. Inez will walk us through a story that demonstrates the horrors and dangers related to an open border, as some suspected terrorists have been nabbed by federal officials. Jeremy will then talk about the political side of this, as Biden has attempted to actually legalize being an illegal immigrant. And I will close this out with an interesting Pew survey about the cultural attitudes of Biden supporters versus Trump supporters. So with that, we will go to Ben to start us off.
Thanks, Amber. And this week, as the world knows, Hunter Biden became a convicted felon over federal gun charges stemming from his purchase and possession and lying about purchasing firearms while a drug addict. From the start, I've long felt that this case represented a cover-up to a cover-up. Wrote about this in a column at the New York Post just before the verdict was handed down. And I think, to me, that is the story. The story is not the headline story here. It's that these federal gun charges were the charges at furthest remove from the Biden family's international influence peddling operation. These charges were only brought, of course, because IRS whistleblowers came forward and claimed that the DOJ had tanked the investigation and prosecution of Hunter Biden and the Biden family, leading to the DOJ to then rush to hastily concoct a sweetheart plea deal with a global immunity, get out of jail free card provision baked into it, which then collapsed under the most basic questioning under Judge Noreka in Delaware. And that led to the DOJ being forced to bring charges to save face, but again, at furthest remove from the charges that actually impact America's national interests. Now, there is, of course, a companion case or an additional case outstanding in Los Angeles, which gets a little bit closer to the influence peddling. But even that is sort of a fig leaf, because the charges there are tax evasion charges, evading taxes on the ill-gotten gains that were a consequence of Hunter Biden's bag manning for this international influence peddling scheme, but no FARA charges associated with it. And again, an effort to separate the charges, which really are rooted in monetizing Joe Biden's name and office, to the president, who is unnamed in that indictment. And we'll see now, by the way, if Hunter Biden ends up inking a plea deal with the DOJ to make that case go away. So all that said, I've been interested to see that I think many others have also adopted this view publicly, and that's lawmakers, pundits, and people in the media and elsewhere who see the case for what it is, that it's really a dodge and a diversionary tactic for the DOJ to be able to say, look, we even prosecute the president's son. There's no hyper-politicization and weaponization here, even though, of course, the regime had to invent crimes to get Trump. And here they had to skirt crime after crime to find the crime at furthest remove from Joe Biden in prosecuting his son. So that's my take on it, but I'm curious to know for the group, first of all, what did you make of the outcome of the case? Do you see there being any political fallout to it? And what are the kind of broader implications or consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think your framing is exactly right. That obviously, and we went through all of this at the time, right? That this is the result first of an attempt at a plea deal of completely getting Hunter out of any consequences for the long list of illegal actions that he's done. When that plea deal was called out by the judge, which is not a common occurrence, right? They decided to bring this gun case, which, I mean, on the facts of it, this is the most basic, open and shut, obvious conviction that you can imagine, right? So he signed a federal document that carries penalties, that he was not an addict and was not a drug user at the time. And then there's all these text messages and videos. By the way, some of them submitted from the Hunter laptop, which is a relevant piece of this. The federal government is now introducing into evidence, right? The Hunter laptop as though it in fact belongs to Hunter Biden and is not a piece of Russian disinformation, the way that, what was it, 50 or 100 intelligence officers came out and said it. And the basis for censoring that story from the Post, from Emma Jo Morris and from Miranda Devine, right? So just a side note there, that was used by the government in court as Hunter's laptop, once again, reiterating that even the Joe Biden government acknowledges that the laptop is real and belongs to Hunter Biden. But in any case, there was just all of this like video and text message evidence that he had lied. And so it was really like open and shut in that way. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with Ben's framing of this as essentially a way to sort of get away with this. But you're already seeing the media and the left using this as a talking point to once again accuse all of us over here at NatCon and many other conservatives of being, sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists for saying that there's a two-tier justice system, right? That's already the talking point that's gone out. Chuck Todd said basically Biden wouldn't have even been prosecuted if he weren't the president's son, which is absurd. First of all, even on the drug and gun charges, there are millions of Americans who've been prosecuted on drug and gun charges. And as I said, this was like a really open and shut case in terms of the evidence. But then there's, of course, the entire iceberg of things that he wasn't prosecuted for that further confirm the quote unquote narrative from the right that there is a two-tier justice system. They had nothing close to this. With Trump, they had, as I think Ben used exactly the right word, they had to invent, both legally and in terms of the underlying facts, they had to invent charges to bring against Trump. Here, they're picking like one needle from a giant haystack of potentially prosecutable behavior, and they've chosen the needle that happens to have nothing to do with the larger influence peddling scheme, how Hunter Biden made his millions of dollars, and the influence that was obviously being sold on behalf of Joe Biden. So,
yeah, I would echo both of you. I mean, I think this is the vindication of the conspiracy right, and in fact, it makes me feel better that there are folks like Ben out there who are writing about this, because it's always what it seemed like to me on the surface, but I don't kind of get into all of these legal details. I'm not an attorney. I kind of investigated every element deeply, but this is really just it's a transparent head fake to me, so that people are talking about the gun charge, and you've even got guys like Thomas Massey going on Twitter, the congressman, saying, hey, I don't even really think this should be a prosecutable gun charge, but pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Or I mean, he is actually saying we should pay attention to the man behind the curtain, but just really it's a clear completely fake attempt to make it look like justice is being blind in this case. And simultaneously, I mean, it really kills two birds with one stone, because one, they can say, oh, well, we're not being political, we're prosecuting the president's son, but it's also prosecuting for this totally fake and less important stuff than the fact that he was running an international influence peddling scheme, as Inez said, that Biden is potentially very deeply enmeshed himself, the president, in that scheme in various ways. And so it's really pathetic, and it's just part of the Biden administration just seeing how much lower they can go.
I think there's a positive and a negative here politically for Biden, which the positive you all covered well, which is that this gives them some way in terms of a narrative to say that there isn't the two-tier justice system. Of course, even beyond just comparing the details of the Trump prosecution versus the Hunter Biden prosecution, we also have evidence of the DOJ going after regular Americans who are only on the conservative side of the political spectrum, whether it's the school board protesters or pro-lifers who are being thrown in jail for praying in the hallways outside of abortion clinics, or going after Catholics because they're supposedly domestic terrorists. I mean, there's more than even just the Trump case and the way that was completely rigged from start to finish to demonstrate this very obvious politicization and weaponization of the Justice Department. But the negative of this case for Biden is that it takes away this talking point that Trump does not deserve to be legitimized because he's a convicted felon. Because obviously he can't make that argument when his own son is a convicted felon. I kind of guessed that that would be one of the excuses for Biden dropping out of the debate that's supposed to be coming up in just a couple of weeks, because there have been Democrats and activists touting this line, well, you shouldn't stand on a stage and legitimize somebody who's a convicted felon. That excuse has really been taken away from Biden with this conviction. So that would be the drawback, I think, for Biden politically.
Yeah, just one more note before we close out this topic on the Second Amendment stuff that Jeremy brought up. So one of the defenses Hunter Biden is bringing is essentially a quite maximalist Second Amendment argument, which is always fun and entertaining just to watch. Of course, Joe Biden, famously very pro-gun control guy, very much in favor of a very narrow reading of the Second Amendment, but here his son in court is arguing for a very expansive reading of the Second Amendment. And there is actually an interesting legal question here to my mind, which is addiction to narcotics more like mental illness? In other words, it's a condition that is sort of continuous, right? That justifies an ongoing prohibition against being able to exercise your Second Amendment rights and buy a gun? Or is it more like the sort of famous example in the Old West, right? Which is, if somebody is really drunk, the sheriff takes away his guns and then he can come and pick them up in the morning, right? But there's no sort of permanent denial of the right to bear arms. And actually, I mean, I think this is like sort of an interesting legal question. We treat the Second Amendment very, very differently than we treat, for example, the First Amendment. Nobody suggests that you lose permanently your right to speak freely because you are an addict or because you have done something, wrong in various aspects of your life. But we treat the Second Amendment very differently, and we put limitations on it. Anyway, I think there is actually an interesting legal question. It'll be really entertaining if this is the case that sets up that legal question. But yeah, so I don't know. I think Ben, you had something to say about this
and
as
it's
well.
worth noting that it, potentially on appeal, the question could come up, and lo and behold, note that the charges weren't brought until after the Bruin Supreme Court decision, which the president himself panned, but which Hunter Biden tried to use to get this case dismissed and to win this case. So we'll see if on appeal you have Hunter Biden as the radical Second Amendment activist up against, in the federal courts.
We also had Biden actually do an event on gun control with every town for gun safety the day that his son was convicted on federal gun charges, which just makes you wonder who at the White House is trying to sabotage him, because you really could not have picked worse optics. But
it's
we're
Kamala.
But
probably
fortunately, he knew
Kamala.
that the media would carry water for him and not report on it, and they didn't, right? It was
Right.
only the conservative folks who were grousing in the background, right? So.
Good point. We're going to go over to Inez, who is going to transition us to the border and a recent sting operation that found, I think, quite a few suspected terrorists.
Yeah, unfortunately, a more somber conversation than the somewhat farcical and hilarious one about Hunter Biden being the greatest Second Amendment advocate in the United States. But unfortunately, so there was this sting. So we have information, right, on this sting that was conducted in Los Angeles, New York, and Philadelphia. It was broken by the New York Post. There are two ISIS. ICE. That's a funny one. Okay, ICE. People from ICE confirmed this sting, but the 6 suspected terrorists have potentially ties to ISIS. These are Russian nationals who are from Tajikistan. So once again, just highlights the fact that it is incredibly dangerous in multiple ways to have an open border. I know we're going to talk about economics and culture and what sort of having a completely open border has done to the United States in terms of politics and everything else, but it's worth highlighting once again that having a completely open border means the obvious, which is that we don't know who's coming into the United States and for what purpose. So part of the chatter around these individuals apparently was there was bomb talk among these individuals, and that fortunately did get picked up by law enforcement. We're fortunate we were able to find them. We have no idea where most of these people are. We have no idea if they're entering the country. We have a rise in Chinese nationals also crossing the border, right? So I think it really highlights the shift in who is coming into the United States now versus even 2 or 3 years ago. Certainly 5 or 10 years ago, the primary immigration topic, right? The character of illegal immigration in the United States was mostly Mexican and national and Latin American people coming in to work. Now, doesn't mean there were no criminals coming in. Obviously, there's all kinds of cultural problems with having mass illegal immigration in that way. But that was a very sort of different underlying problem than what's happening right now, which is that young men from Muslim North Africa, from the stands, right, the former Soviet republics, from African countries, from Arab countries are crossing the border and entering the United States. And we see this just in an obvious way. If you live in one of the cities where you've seen the current uptick in migration, you've seen the profile of people change. So I know down in, Tompkins Square Park near me, it's no longer Latin American or Mexican families and men who are looking to work for $10 an hour. It's now young, mostly unattached, something like 17, 18 to 25 men. And they are Arab, African, that culturally they couldn't be sort of more obviously alien to the United States. Like I think I've said on here before that walking around these kinds of migrant hangouts feels a little bit like the only thing I can compare it to is East Jerusalem. Especially walking around as a woman, you feel like this is the first time they've ever seen women in jeans, right? So this is a very different character of migration. And of course, those populations carry with them, first of all, a large percentage of people who hold views that are totally antithetical and hostile to the traditional, culture and values and commitments of the United States. And then within that large category of people who hold those views, a small percentage of them are willing to do violence to carry it out. And they mean the United States very direct, violent harm. And we have no idea where these people are, who they are, how many of them are crossing the border. The fact that we found this one sting of 6 people tells us nothing other than the fact that they are obviously there. And nothing about how many of them are there. So with that, on that scary note, I guess I'll turn it over to the rest of you guys to talk about, what are the implications of this? How is this going to be received by the American public? Are we going to see this blip in the media and then go down? I mean, and then what are the real national security dangers of having the border as open as it is? I mean, we talk a lot, and we will, I think, this podcast talk about all of the other consequences of having this lawless open border, but this is one that's particularly scary.
This is pretty inevitable, right? Because I mean, what happened was these individuals saw an opportunity that didn't exist for them to hop on an airplane and fly to the United States and sneak in that way. But they saw that we weren't enforcing our border, or that even when we were, there's simply an opportunity for them to cross in sectors that had fewer border patrol agents or didn't have fencing. And they just took advantage of it. I mean, people are literally flying into Latin America and then walking up with groups of Venezuelans and Guatemalans, hoping to sneak through. What was really disturbing about this sting on the individuals with suspected ISIS ties is that I believe I read in some of the reporting that they were not gotaways, meaning they were processed at the southern border. They got in illegally, and the processing did not catch that they were suspected terrorists.
Yeah.
Which is
did not
obvious.
Flag anything.
It didn't flag anything, and it's an indictment of the fact that when Biden says the issue is we just need to process people faster, we need more means of putting people through the background checks before they get into the United States, that's obviously not the solution to actually protecting the border. That's not real border security. And 2, I mean, it's been a problem not even just for illegal immigration, but also the refugee process, that we really don't have a means of screening for ideology and cultural issues that often arise from people coming from some of these places where, as Inez put it, they're openly hostile to the United States. I mean, we saw a similar problem with a lot of the Afghanistan refugees, when within 2 weeks of them coming to stay on military bases in the US, we had child sexual assaults, numerous domestic violence incidents. instances. And yeah, if you're just looking for a criminal background, like you might not find those things if they don't have a prior arrest or a prior conviction on that. And we just frankly don't have the ability with the way that our processing works or the way our vetting works to make sure that the people who are coming here are able to assimilate into U.S. culture, and at the very least not be again, like antithetical or hostile to American ideas and values. And that's a problem beyond just illegal immigration, but really the entire immigration system.
Yeah, I think there's a potential here, and I certainly agree with what both of you said, though, for an interesting kind of October surprise. And whether that would happen as a result of state actors will send the left into even more kind of paranoia. But people are sort of discounting the fact that we could have a very serious terrorist attack on U.S. soil before the election from groups that would be clearly identified as kind of having walked through Biden's open border. And while I think that in general, it's pretty clear that that sort of a crisis usually rebounds to favor the existing president, I think in this particular case, given Biden's policy on the border, there would be a huge negative rebound toward him. I don't think that's really priced into how people are thinking about this election. I mean, I think that will happen eventually is an inevitability to me. The only question is whether it is targeted and happens before the election that we're going to see this sort of thing. But obviously it's just part of a broader lawlessness from the Democratic Party, from the, even the administration, the immigration bureaucracy in terms of how it processes people. And I kind of throw up my hands because I don't even know how we live with people under the same system who are doing this type of stuff. But
9/11 was chiefly an immigration failure, and the response has been 2 decades more of immigration insanity, including mass migration from Muslim majority countries, which it only takes a very small percentage, as we've seen, of jihadists to cause utter chaos and really cause generational damage to our country. If you were to trace all of the effects of 9/11, I think we'd view almost all of them as horrible, besides the immediate term unity in the country for, several weeks, or really, I sort of kid, but for a short period of time. The results of that have been disastrous. We probably still haven't accounted for all the consequences of it. And, even more perversely, I think it's guaranteed that we're going to have any number of jihadist attacks on our country. It's guaranteed that those cells are already here and operating. There have been any number of threats that have been prosecuted. There are fatwas on the heads of several Trump administration officials from Iran. And I think, a question for those who assume that our vetting is totally insufficient, including, to Amber's point, for ideology, and anti-American ideology and subversive ideology. You have to ask the question, well, why haven't we seen so many attacks? And part of it, no doubt, is good cop work. But part of it also is, if you were the enemy, why would you attack when we're doing so many damaging things to ourselves? And even beyond that, let's entertain that October surprise scenario for a second. Now, it's true, it's unpredictable how the public would respond to that and how the administration would respond to it. But if you thought it would redound to Joe Biden's detriment, if you were the enemy, why would you attack if you felt that you were better off with the U.S. in Joe Biden's hands? So I've long theorized that part of it is that we've stopped and neutralized attacks, but another part of it is that our enemies know that we're doing enough damage by ourselves and they're better off not engaging. We'll see what happens ultimately with that. But the other perverse part that I would mention is to combat jihadism. We had the creation of this entire massive new national security apparatus and powers ceded to the federal government. And of course, with mission creep, they've been turned on Americans. And it's worth noting, Merrick Garland, just I think a day ago, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he wrote, quote, "Continued unfounded attacks against the Justice Department's employees are dangerous for people's safety." And of course, this is a reference to criticism of the DOJ for being hyper-politicized and weaponized under his leadership. He says these attacks are dangerous for our democracy. This must stop. And it's worth noting that the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism says that the government and there must be a whole of society effort to pursue those attacking our institutions, including pursuing them as equivalent to terrorists. So we have a real jihadist threat that grows by the day, and it's already here and guaranteed massive. But the government is diverting its resources to focus on populist, nationalist, and conservatives as the real domestic terrorists and abusing our liberties in pursuing us. So it's a recipe for disaster all around, in my view.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. And we obviously can talk about the border for ages, which is lucky for us today because Jeremy is now actually going to lead us into more discussion on immigration, but from more of a political viewpoint.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amber. And a lot of this is just I want to respond to kind of this very transparent leak that has been going on where the Biden administration is leaking to friendly media about the possibilities of their doing a so-called parole in place for essentially the spouses, the illegal alien spouses of people who are here legally or who are U.S. citizens. And this could expand or contract. It could be a bigger category. But I'd say two things. I mean, one, the fact that this is even being contemplated at a time in which the border is wide open and this kind of time just shows the kind of complete transparent absurdity of the Biden administration really claiming that they have any interest in border security. Now, Mitch McConnell, in what was the most, and this is really judging on a scale of a lot of incompetent actions, the most incompetent action I've seen from a GOP leader in maybe a decade, has managed to hand the Democrats this talking point by this stupid fake enforcement bill that we, brought up before Immigration Patriots shot it down. So he's allowed the Biden administration to attempt to evade responsibility for the fact that they have the border wide open, at least in the minds of low information voters. But this just sort of shows the degree of bad faith that the Biden administration has on it. And it was really interesting that you even have guys like Mark Kelly, the Democratic senator from Arizona, saying, yeah, this is a transparent plea for Hispanic votes. And the campaign's feeling it's clear the campaign is very involved in it. We're hoping at the margin it'll get some additional votes for Biden among Latino voters. So it's just it's a transparently political scheme. At the same time, they're trying to gauge what the reaction from the public is. So they're all saying, well, Joe Biden hasn't actually seen it yet. So it's all of the worst of DC really rolled up into one. It is an indication of the Democrats' kind of just truly radical open borders position that this sort of thing is being contemplated, that does nothing but encourage more illegal immigration. And it's just a sobering reminder of, again, where we are, I think, as a country, that if you're interested in border security, we don't even have an interlocutor with whom we could come to a good faith compromise, right? Because it's just they don't have any interest in enforcing America's border or treating us like a sovereign nation.
One thing I'd add on that is, as with so many other issues, it's so advantageous to be on the left and on offense here because immigration typically ranks as a plurality most important issue. I mean, maybe inflation and the economy right now in the presidential election, but immigration is always a top 3 issue for Americans and usually more on the conservative side. However, even if you had a sweep of truly national sovereignty oriented Republicans through offices throughout the land, still you have to deal with the consequences of the millions of illegal aliens who are already here. And all it takes is Democrats sweeping back into power to push the needle even further. So it puts us in a real bind to the extent you care about preserving anything resembling America and a sovereign nation when you have the consequences to deal with of a policy where even if you win politically and even if the American people completely reject what's occurred, if Democrats are going to portray the conservative position as you deport millions of people callously and rip children away, et cetera, it makes it very difficult ultimately, and again shows the advantage of being on the left and on offense.
Going back to Jeremy's reporting on what the Biden administration is planning to do with illegal spouses of legal residents of the United States. I mean, it just demonstrates what a farce this executive order on asylum was. I mean, in addition to this story, right, the Biden administration also sent a memo to Border Patrol in the San Diego sector telling them that they should essentially release anyone who comes across from a list of 100 plus countries. The only exclusions were 6 countries. And then there's additional reporting from conservative friendly immigration reporters who are down at the border that when Biden says removal proceedings, what he actually means is you get a court date. So all of this talk about, oh, well, we're going to put them through expedited removal or they're going to be immediately referred for removal proceedings. Okay, but then they're in the US and we already know that most of them don't show up to their court dates in the first place. There's no possible way to track them because their little CBP app that they use only tracks them when they actively check into the program. So they can just not check in and the government has no ability to find out where they are and actually go through the process of removing or deporting them. So it's such a joke. I mean, obviously the executive order also does not apply to unaccompanied minors who are going to be trafficked by cartels and then through chain migration, eventually their families will come through. You have people who are victims of severe forms of trafficking excluded from the details of the executive order. And like, spoiler alert, that applies to everybody right now because the cartel completely controls who gets to cross the border. The women pay in sex and the men pay in going into the United States, getting a job and sending a certain amount of their money back to the cartel to pay for the cost of being trafficked across the border. So those are the definitions literally of severe forms of trafficking, is being coerced into providing sexual or financial benefit to someone who is trafficking you. So, I mean, the exceptions render the order completely nullified. I mean, not to mention the fact that there's apparently still a process in which these people can claim credible fear and get a court hearing anyway. It was all just a game for Biden to pretend that he's being tough on the border, to try to push that issue down on where it stands in voters' minds right now. But the details, the devil's in the details, as it always is with so many of these immigration moves.
Yeah, I think Amber nicely highlighted some of the obvious lawless problems at the border, but all of our discussion here has highlighted, frankly, as much opprobrium as the Biden administration deserves for essentially turning on all the executive taps the opposite way as they should be, as opposed to the Trump administration that did a bunch of executive action to try to limit this problem. This is not a problem that is exclusively defined by executive action, sort of yay and nay, right? Part of the problem that Amber is talking about with people being released into the United States, we have a set of laws, both asylum laws and our general immigration laws, that encourage people to make this very dangerous trek into the United States, encourage them to contract with cartels, encourage them to cross very difficult terrain where a lot of them just die from the elements, right? Because we do not have a sane, lawful immigration policy and haven't had one for at least 30, 40 years at this point. Now, we can turn the dial on or off in terms of executive enforcement, and that does make a difference. And we saw how it made a difference under the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. You have a perfect setup of an administration that wanted to do something as much as it could about immigration without going through Congress, right? Which was an impossibility, and an administration that wants, obviously, the policy preference of the Biden administration is to bring as many people here as possible. And any moves to the contrary are just the fig leaves that Amber described in terms of getting him out from under political opprobrium for doing so. But and that is, I don't want to downplay that that's not, a difference. Obviously, it makes a difference, at this point. There are plenty of places in the US, almost everywhere in the US has seen what a difference, with their own eyes, what a difference those kinds of policies make. So I don't want to downplay it. But this is not just a problem of executive policies. This is 30 to 40 years of incentives for people to come here illegally. and to work in the US illegally, to stay in the US illegally. We in the previous segment, we didn't bring up the fact that 9/11 hijackers were visa overstays. We have a huge visa overstay problem in the United States, right? We do not have a functional, lawful immigration system in the United States. And people are noticing that, like people in the world notice that and act on those incentives to, often tragic consequences that Amber was talking about with regard to trafficking and the sort of human cost along the border, obvious political consequences for the United States, national security consequences for the United States. This is just a massive problem that nobody has actually tackled for 40 years because of various incentives on the left and the right to ignore that it's happening, which is why it shows up in polls over and over and over again, because it's a huge problem that Americans see with their own eyes that is just not getting addressed. Administration after administration, Congress after Congress, this problem is not actually getting addressed in like a serious way. Just one final side point about the appeal to Hispanic voters. Obviously, the Biden administration politically is worried about that because there does appear to be a pretty substantial shift right on this and a bunch of other issues. But it's not at all obvious, by the way, that this is a good appeal to Hispanic voters to leave the border this lawless. Pew has some polling of Latino voters in the United States. It's pretty like evenly split, but there's still a majority comparatively. There are more Latino voters who are in favor of making it harder for asylum seekers to be given temporary legal status in the United States while waiting for their hearing than there are Latino voters against that. That would be the immigration restrictionist position, right? There are more Latino voters who are in favor of putting severe penalties on businesses if they hire people who are not legally allowed to work in the United States than there are Latino voters against that proposition. So it's not at all clear to me that this is the kind of pandering appeal that is even going to work very well.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and kick it back to myself. And we're going to actually talk about some other Pew research that came out that's really fascinating about how Biden supporters and Trump supporters differ on cultural issues. And some of the differences are incredibly stark. So I'm just going to read through a few of the questions that they asked and what the responses were. And then I'll let y'all sort of chime in with your analysis of it. But there was a question on immigration, and it was phrased, America's openness to people from all over the world is essential to who we are as a nation. 87% of Biden supporters agreed with that sentiment, whereas only 36% of Trump supporters did. This one is fascinating. They asked about, of course, gender identity issues. And the statement that they asked about was someone can be a man or a woman, even if that is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. 59% of Biden supporters agree that you can have a different gender than your birth sex. Only 9% of Trump supporters agreed with that statement. 81% of Trump supporters agree that the criminal justice system is not tough enough on criminals. 40% of Biden supporters agreed with that. And this one is perhaps the most disturbing. 59% of Trump supporters rightfully said that society is better off if people make marriage and children a priority. Only 19% of Biden supporters said that society is better when people prioritize marriage and children. And I just love this poll because I think it really gets at the heart of really the political division in America and why we're suffering from this crisis of loneliness and lack of community ties. I mean, when you have a bunch of people who just disagree with fundamental tenets of not even just American values in society, but really just Western civilization in general. So I'm going to kick it over to you guys, but this is probably the most illustrative poll that has come out in the past like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I'd agree, Amber. I mean, it was a pretty shocking poll, or maybe not shocking because at some level you'd sort of seen sort of similar things, but it definitely did a nice job of consolidating it all right there for us. And I would point out, the marriage and family statistic was particularly shocking, but shocking in 2 ways, I think. I mean, one, of course, the enormous gap, and I say this, I'm married, I have 5 kids. So I obviously think that's sort of an important thing that one should do. But the fact that only even 59% of Trump supporters felt that way was just as shocking to me in terms of a kind of civilizational death wish, because to me this is the most fundamental thing. And I'm certainly glad that Trump supporters were overwhelmingly more likely to be in a pro-family position than Biden supporters. But it's still kind of a shockingly low number to me, 59%. I think the immigration number, just also to come back to our earlier conversation, I've written elsewhere about kind of the myth of the nation of immigrants, and kind of understanding that our kind of current conception of this idea comes back to the 1960 John F. Kennedy presidential campaign and then decades of propaganda that followed, but was not really the way that we had conceived of ourselves as a country, particularly before that, or at least not in a unanimous way. But I think it's revelatory that 87% of Democrats had this view that in fact this is kind of the way that we identify America today. So they've fully bought into the regime propaganda. But even again, 36% of Republicans kind of feeling the same way. It's not a negligible number, and it shows why it's really good to control the means of cultural production.
Yeah, the culture war is not a distraction by a bunch of rich people or activists with what do you call it, like puppeteering the American people. The what's the matter with Kansas thesis is wrong. There is a real cultural divide in the country. This is not a culture war is not manufactured by elites. It's very real. There are increasingly obviously there are many different worldviews in America, but increasingly there are two incompatible worldview commitments in the country that loosely correspond to the parties, but are much deeper than any sort of partisan politics. And that's what we're seeing in these polls. I do get kind of frustrated with this idea that the cultural battles that we have are somehow less important than the quote unquote real politics, which is only about inflation or the economy, about jobs and GDP. All of those things are very important, and prosperity in America is one of our defining qualities, right? And the fact that people in America have the sort of birthright to expect that the next generation will do better than their parents economically is, and the fact that seems to be like the consensus seems to be that is slipping, is of course something that is incredibly important both in our lives and our politics. But it is not more important than the fact that we now look at the world, the West, patriotism, family formation, the very basic building blocks of male and female, religion, morality. We look at these things in different and often opposing ways. That is not a sort of irrelevancy to our politics that is invented by people who would like you to look the other way while they lower taxes or raise taxes, frankly, on the rich or on corporations in America. And in my view, so there's this famous Breitbart quote that is always misused, and I think I've said this before on this podcast and many others because I'm just fighting this to the death, which is that politics is downstream from culture. And when Andrew Breitbart said that, he did not, I know it's now used as a quotation by David French and a bunch of other people to say that essentially cultural issues cannot be addressed politically, which is the exact opposite of what Andrew Breitbart was saying with that. He was saying we have a politics, especially on the right, that is focused on what they consider the quote unquote real political issues of dollars and cents, and ignoring the 5-alarm fire in education, in what Jeremy called the means of cultural production, right? In the arts. These are not sort of side issues. These are issues that are absolutely central to our conception as Americans and to our politics, and they ought to continue to be at the center of our politics.
Well, and to that point, I think this is why cultural Marxism is such a potent force, and why the Frankfurt School types, and not just Marcuse, but then going back to Gramsci and the others, I mean, they were very shrewd. They said the culture war, you have to win the culture war ultimately to destroy the West as we know it, and they've done a pretty darn good job over the last 100 years here. The polling numbers to me are consistent with the polls that we've seen on declining shares of Americans who value or elevate God, family, and country. Similar here, although I think to Jeremy's point, the numbers are staggering in a couple of different dimensions here when it comes to marriage and children. My initial knee-jerk reaction was actually, is the left suicidal? Because if you don't value marriage and children, then you're not going to procreate, and ultimately you're probably going to lose in the politics. Now, that also brings to mind a question of, do people operate in their own lives the same way that they might poll? Charles Murray talked about in Coming Apart the fact that for the elites at least, their personal lives and their family lives end up looking very traditional and conservative. So they do not practice what they preach. But the masses have to deal with the consequences of the disastrous policies that they do promote. Maybe there's an element of that here. But I would say, the other aspect that Jeremy's comments kind of got me thinking about were, if you're not pro-family, then what does that make you? Does it make you pro-individual, which, individualism can be a good thing and a bad thing. There's obviously a difference between liberty and libertinism. And then there's obviously also a difference, between kind of being narcissistic and a slave to your appetites ultimately, or actually a productive person who self-actualizes and pursues whatever their God-given purpose is. Although I guess many of the non-pro-family people probably might not say they have necessarily a God-given purpose. But if you're not pro-family, are you pro-individual or are you pro-state? I mean, that seems to me that the state replaces your family. None of those responses, I think, are satisfactory or good. And to the extent these polls are representative, I mean, what does it say about the long-term trajectory of the country? Again, maybe it means that the left is going to become a declining share, and those who are pro-family, which is generally going to be on the right, are going to make up an increasing share. And so politically, that'll cause ultimately victory for the right. But the demographic situation and something that we've talked about before, the fact that we have, by many measures, the most prosperous society and world in the history of mankind, yet birth rates are declining and we're below replacement level throughout much of the wealthy Western world. What does that say? The implications are staggering, and all of them, I think, terrifying, frankly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
I also
for once. Oh,
ahead.
sorry. For once, it behooves me to weigh in on the pessimistic side of Ben. The idea that simply the people who value marriage and children are going to outbreed the people who don't ignores the fact that the left controls the institutions. They don't need to have
That's
children.
exactly
They
what I
have
was going to
yours.
say.
That they educate, as long as we turn over the means of cultural production, which I kind of like Jeremy's joke there, to the left, it's far from a foregone conclusion that the people who have large families will recognize their children and their grandchildren in the country that they live in.
That's exactly what I was going to say is, I meet conservatives all the time who ask me, I raised my kid and I thought I was doing everything right, and they turned out to be a total like left-wing crazy, and I don't know where I went wrong. And I'm like, did you send them to public school? They go, yeah, I did. I'm like, well, it's like a harsh truth, but yeah, as long as we're sending kids through the leftist controlled education system, a lot of parents really don't stand a chance. So it's I'd like to think we can out reproduce, but that also requires parents to be incredibly hands-on with what their kids are consuming and learning in society. So we're gonna move to final thoughts. Whoever wants to take that on first, feel free.
So I'll just be really brief and just shine a light on a story that broke this week from Empower Oversight, which is represents whistleblowers, federal government whistleblowers, namely, and also does some of the oversight work through FOIA and beyond that Congress sometimes fails to. They revealed that an FBI employee who they were representing came forth with documents showing that essentially there were ideological litmus tests being placed on this employee, who was investigated, I think, in part because essentially he was a conservative, and I think he was present near the Capitol on January 6th. The FBI security division asked a series of questions of his colleagues, including wondering, did he vocalize support for President Trump? Did he vocalize objection to COVID-19 vaccination? Did he vocalize an intent to attend January 6, 2021? The fact that this was being asked of FBI employees just illustrates just a further illustration of something that we've seen directionally, but we've also seen more increasing anecdotal evidence of, which is that increasingly, if you don't hold the regime's ideology, you're treated as effectively an enemy of the state. This goes for not only just conservative activists, but it also goes for people in the military, people in the national security apparatus more broadly, and obviously including those in the FBI as well. And the end result is that through self-selection and then also through purging, you're going to end up with every single one of these institutions, not just at the senior levels, but all the way down to the rank and file, consisting of people who all ideologically hold the same view. And you start to run into then a question of, are these federal forces regime forces, or do they represent America? I think that's in part the point. And a scary parallel I would draw on, kind of the slippery slope that we're going down is, it's worth noting that in China, for example, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, that is the Chinese Communist Party's army. We should have nothing resembling that sort of direction in America, but that is increasingly the kind of trajectory that we're on.
Yeah, I'll add my own concluding thoughts, and based a little bit on some of the things that Amber and other folks had mentioned earlier. What strikes me as kind of a running theme through some of the things we've been talking about today is just how much the Democrats' entire grand strategy, particularly in the short term for the election, but even broader than that, is a high-low strategy that combines getting the support of the intelligentsia and getting the support of the stupidest, lowest information voters that they can, and combining that into a winning coalition against the American middle class. So I look at the fake Hunter Biden trial, the fake Trump trial, and the only people who are fooled by these things are a large number of partisan Democrats who have a personal desire to be fooled by them, but also these kind of independent, low information voters who say, oh, Trump's a convicted felon and Hunter Biden was convicted, so the system's working and Trump is bad. Similarly, these moves on immigration that I talked about, none of this should be fooling anybody who's paying attention. The only people it fools are people who are Democrats who want to be fooled, or the kind of dumbest independents. And it's sobering and depressing to look at America in 2024 and see the Democrats so vividly pursue a strategy that will only work in fooling a bunch of idiots, and it tells you what they think of the American electorate. And I certainly hope that they are not proven right. But as the late P.T. Barnum said, no one ever went broke underestimating the taste of the American public. And hopefully we will not say the same thing about the intellect of the average American voter. But I guess we'll see in November.
I'll piggyback off of that by pointing out that the Democratic Party perhaps did not anticipate really how hoarding that group of low information voters could potentially backfire. Although maybe you could consider these people part of the intelligentsia. I guess it just depends on your viewpoint. But
Right.
There were a series of protests against the Biden administration over the weekend from the pro-Palestinian progressive contingent of the party. There was a massive, essentially riot outside of the White House where they vandalized a bunch of statues and left trash and graffiti everywhere. But in addition, there was a Code Pink protester that interrupted Kamala Harris at an event in San Francisco as a fundraiser for Biden. And then again, when she spoke at a dinner hosted by the Michigan Democratic Party on Sunday night, someone calling her out for supporting a genocide. So they have basically handed their party over to people who could be in the process of actively destroying their chances in November, because they really rely on that progressive base to be their most vociferous activists and likely voters.
Yeah, just a few bullet points to hit, news points that I think are worth bringing up, but didn't merit an entire segment. First, of course, the rescue of hostages in a kind of a bold Entebbe style operation that correspondingly was characterized in some kind of moral upside down land by the left and the media in the United States as like somehow like morally condemnable to go and rescue hostages that were taken in contravenance of any kinds of Western laws of war, which of course Hamas does not operate by, and then held in civilian areas, which maximize the probability that civilians would be caught up in the crossfire. This is, of course, this is Hamas's strategy. This is in all kinds of documents of theirs. They're quite open about it, especially when they speak in Arabic. They are trying to create as high civilian casualties as possible. They see that as the best chance they have to win the war. And the left in the United States is playing right into that, obviously, for all the reasons we've discussed many times. Second, it's just worth mentioning, even though completely not worth actually discussing at length. And there's a sort of strategic question as to whether we ought to discuss the details at all of any of these charges. But the drumbeat against the Supreme Court continues with this time with some leftist activists leaking a very controversial tape of her discussion at a private party with Justice Alito, in which we discovered that Justice Alito is both conservative and Catholic. This no doubt will come as a total shock to anybody who has ever heard the justice speak in public or read any of his opinions. The fact that he's not lying about being a devout Catholic in public. Anyway, this is a nothing burger of a story, but it's a reminder that there is this constant drumbeat to delegitimize the Supreme Court now that it is not returning consistently, ruling after ruling in favor of the left. And the sort of details of each one of these hits gets more and more absurd the longer it goes on. They clearly led with their biggest ammo, which itself was ridiculous, with Justice Thomas, starting out with the fact that the justice has a rich friend, and now we are literally at the level of, at a cocktail party, Justice Alito admitted that he's a conservative Catholic. So that's the ammo that it has. That being said, again, as I said last week or the week before, if you are one of these low information voters that Jeremy was talking about, what you see is a series of headlines that say scandal and ethical problems at the Supreme Court.
That's right. Yeah, it was a huge bombshell, especially the part where Justice Alito reaffirmed the limited scope of the court in deciding cases as opposed to affecting political change. It was truly incredible. That's going to do it for us this week. But on behalf of Inez, Ben, and Jeremy, I'm Amber Duke. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.